name's Ilyas. I'm the racial justice lead at Amnesty International UK. So I lead our organisation's policy and research work in relation to racial justice, and that's sort of the theme of today's topic. And specifically what we're going to be talking about is the area of pre-crime. So this is the various ways in which surveillance, suspicion, criminalisation all exist before any action, commission, or even intention of committing a crime or an act that is criminalised. So today I'm going to really be talking about the impact of government developments in the area of pre-crime. So specifically today we're going to be focusing on the government's prevent duty, as well as the data-based and data-driven predictive policing tools which are operated by police forces across the UK, as well as some developments around protests, and it all ties together. So really we're going to be aiming to help understand how these measures work, and think through their impact, their possible future developments in this space, and how communities can come together to organise to defend their rights. So I'm sure Alyssa already gave loads of background on what Amnesty International UK is, but specifically within the area of racial justice, what we aim to do is develop campaigns and be in coalition with other organisations, grassroots communities, to develop campaigns to dismantle racist state systems. And it's our belief that these campaigns can be strengthened by strong human rights-based research. So by framing the practices and the actions of the state in human rights terms, we hope to create and communicate a strong narrative around racism contributing to an environment where human rights are not respected, fulfilled or enjoyed. And the hope and the aim is this will help contribute to increasing recognition amongst the wider public, amongst people in politics, and amongst communities impacted, leading to greater pressure for change. And a really key part of how we're working as well as what we're working on, what I've just spoken about, how we're working is really important to the work we do as well, because we want to be known not just for what we do, but also how we do it. So really working intentionally and carefully with impacted communities and in collaboration with them. So what sort of stuff are we working on? So the theme of today's session is around presumption, not of innocence, but of guilt. So I want to focus on the measures, restrictions, the surveillance faced by individuals and communities before the intention, commission or action of any act that has been designated as a crime in legislation. So what we're going to be talking about is very much the pre-crime space, the increased use of pre-crime measures, the myths and the fantasy that often surrounds it, and why it's so important to our rights and civil liberties that we challenge its increasing adoption by various arms of the state. But before that, I just want to take a quick step back to look at the last few years. But also, if at any point I'm talking too fast, just let me know. I have an annoying habit of doing it. So whether heavy-handed policing at protests or the passing of successive repressive legislation, avenues for dissent are shrinking. Meanwhile, through the expansion of prevent, changes to the school curriculum, the clamping down on free speech in universities, successive governments are creating an environment where young people, adult learners in education and others are not coming into full realization of their rights. It's our hypothesis that all of these pieces of state policy and law collectively could be seen as a state attempt to create a compliant generation. Amnesty International UK has scoped multiple areas for concern. So firstly, as a result of changes to PHSE curriculum and curriculums in schools, guidance around protest in schools, we're seeing external groups not allowed in schools, and where materials, including from external groups, not being allowed into schools. And that's creating a situation where young people may not be being fully informed about their human rights, which they should be able to exercise freely without any impediment. As a result of this, young people are less likely to be aware of violations of human rights when they occur, either to them or in their proximity. Additionally, the presence of policies such as prevent are alleged to have a chilling effect on young people, leading to a reaction of self-censorship, thereby preventing them from fully exercising their civil and political rights, so their ability to speak up, to talk about issues in the world that they see around them. topics that they may see as too controversial or political to raise in a classroom. Similarly, deployments of policing in schools or the technological advancements of algorithmic or predictive policing put at risk not just data about people, but also could have dire consequences in defining their interactions with the police. Where people do choose to resist, traditional tactics of activism, such as divestment campaigns or protests, have been or have faced recently challenges to restrict the full exercising of these tactics. Where organizations in the past have brought this to attention, they are facing a hostile landscape in the public arena. We also see regulators such as the Charity Commission allegedly clamp down on organizations who are increasingly vocal, and the Charity Commission itself becoming increasingly vocal about charities and organizations being very careful about the campaigning and advocacy of activities that they do. And finally, where violations are documented, the changes to judicial review, devastating cuts to legal aid have made it difficult for individuals or organizations to seek meaningful redress. So that's really just setting the scene for this shrinking space for dissent, the shrinking space for remedy that is happening. So the picture overall isn't a particularly pleasant or positive one. We know, for example, that race and racism is a feature that plays a defining role in people's interaction with the police and with other public sector bodies and authorities. It can, in some cases, play the defining role in differentiating a response that could, in some cases, lead to life or death. It can be a feature defining whether you're stopped and searched in a way that makes you late to a job interview, where it's a defining feature in whether you feel comfortable walking through your city or town centre, and so much more. And those aren't just my words. The National Police Chiefs Council acknowledged in 2024 that black people are twice as likely to be arrested, 3 times as likely to be subject to police use of force, 4 times as likely to be stopped and searched. The chair of the National Police Chiefs Council has publicly admitted that policing is institutionally racist. In the year ending March 2023, there were 24.5 stops and searches for every 1,000 black people, 9.9 stops and searches for every 1,000 people with mixed ethnicity, 8.5 for every 1,000 Asian people, 5.9 for every 1,000 white people. In 2018, black people were 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched under Section 1 of PACE for suspected drug possession, despite using drugs at a lower rate than white people. Racialized people overall are overrepresented in stop and search compared to both their representation in the population and even their involvement in police records of crime. The vast majority of stop and searches in the UK, 69%, lead to no further action. In 2023, the Children's Commissioner revealed black children were 6 times more likely to be strip searched in England and Wales than white children. Between 2018 and 2022, at least 2,847 children were strip searched pre-arrest. 38% of these were black children. Half of these led to no further action. In 2023, the Casey Review found the Met in London were institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic, and racism and racial bias are reinforced within the Met systems. The review acknowledged over-policing and disproportionate use of powers against certain communities, stating most prominently this includes stop and search, use of force, intimate strip searches, injury or deaths of black, Asian and racialized Londoners, including deaths in custody, in the pursuit of subject or during an arrest. Racialized people, especially black people, are arrested, remanded, charged, prosecuted, convicted and imprisoned at higher rates than white people. So that is just a segment of what I want to introduce to help explain the idea of presumption, not of innocence, but of guilt, of children, adults, individuals, whole communities who are not afforded the idea of innocence, but designated as unruly, as trouble, as suspect, and indeed as criminal. The first pre-crime surveillance I want to talk about is the government's prevent duty. I'm okay to ask questions to everyone, right? Who's heard of prevent? Yeah? So the prevent strategy, so a lot of people have spoken about it within the context of education, which it arrives at sort of later on. But just taking everyone back a little bit. So the prevent strategy is one of the 4 elements of the UK's counter-terrorism strategy contest. Prevent's stated aim is to stop people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. It operates in what is sometimes referred to as the pre-crime space, what we're talking about today. So this involves intervening in the lives of people whom the authorities can't deem at risk of, who the authorities deem at risk of committing a crime, but who have not yet done so. The 2023 contest strategy states Prevent's objectives are tackling the ideological causes of terrorism, intervening early to support people susceptible to radicalization, and enabling people who have already engaged in terrorism to disengage and rehabilitate. Under the second objective, an individual deemed at risk of being drawn into terrorism can be referred to the police or their local authority. Police will assess the case and decide whether to refer it to a local channel panel in England and Wales or Prevent multi-agency panel in Scotland. So Prevent doesn't apply to Northern Ireland, I should say. So the channel programme is a multi-agency approach to identify and provide support to individuals who are at risk of being drawn into terrorism. This is from the contest strategy. So local channel panels composed of police, other public agencies, evaluate cases and offer the individual concerned a support plan to prevent their potential future involvement in terrorism. So where Prevent comes from and where people, when we talk about the evolution of Prevent, as you identified, so Prevent has changed significantly since its inception in 2003. So it was actually started by the last Labour government. So between 2006 and 2011, it focused almost exclusively on so-called Islamist extremism, targeting only Muslim communities. So this involved funding local projects, what you spoke about, so including sports clubs, education, arts initiatives, and a real emphasis on community cohesion. The UK government piloted the Channel programme in 2007 and rolled it out across England and Wales in 2012. Following a 2011 government review overseen by Lord Carlisle, Prevent was expanded to include all types of activity that might be defined as extremism, including non-violent extremism. And between 2011 and 2014, Prevent became less about community cohesion and more about integration. So a real focus on that sort of concept. And in 2014, the government introduced a statutory duty on schools to promote British values. So this might have been around the time you were in education where you started to see this language. So British values was first defined in 2011, but became a statutory duty in schools later on. And then really where Prevent enters notoriety and sort of into the public lexicon is in 2015, when Prevent was expanded again. So this required all specified authorities to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism and in the exercise of their functions. So specified authorities defined by the Act included bodies such as local authorities, prison services, schools, certain youth groups, hospitals, other NHS services. So really, this is the point where the entire public sector gets co-opted into counter-extremism, policing effectively. So the UK is the first country in Europe to introduce a duty like this in its counter-terrorism legislation, making Prevent the first ever large-scale soft power counter-terrorism approach. So the Prevent duty, as I said, applies to specified authorities, which means that they must have policies in place to identify individuals considered at risk of being drawn into terrorism. It applies to institutions without creating any additional duties. It requires institutions to pay due regard to the need to safeguard people from being drawn into terrorism whilst exercising their existing functions. People are identified as at risk of being drawn into terrorism based on certain indicators, which staff of specified authorities are trained to look out for. So I'm just going to list out some of the indicators as defined by the Vulnerability Assessment Framework, which is in fact the things that people need to look out for to determine whether someone should be referred to Prevent or not. And you could do a quick hands up if you would feel like this applies to you, or if you don't want to put your hand up, that's also fine. So if you have ever felt feelings of grievance or injustice, yeah? If you've ever in your life had a desire for status, ever had a desire for adventure and excitement? Yeah? Or you've ever felt, looking at the world around you, a desire for political or moral change? So those are just some of the indicators those are some of the indicators that staff are trained to look out for. And it's not necessarily to say that, they see one person trying to say something and they just refer them straight away, although that has happened, right? Like, there are cases where we know of children, including very young children, who have been referred to Prevent for all sorts of ridiculous reasons, right? You might have seen some of those examples reported in the news. You might have heard of the cucumber case. I think was it a 5 or 6 year old who was asked in school to draw something that happens at home, drew a stickman figure of the dad cutting a cucumber, making a cucumber sandwich. Teaching adult in the room didn't hear the word cooker bomb, but interpreted it as didn't hear the word cucumber, interpreted it as cooker bomb, thought the picture was the dad making a cooker bomb, and referred the child to Prevent. Another instance of a primary school student who was asked to describe what their home looks like, tried to say their home's connected to other houses, a terraced house. Imagine what word was heard, and a referral to Prevent goes through. So there's all sorts of stories within the public domain of children, including very young children, who have been referred to Prevent. Yeah, what happens when you create an environment where staff are all taught from the offset they need to look out for these things and therefore feel like they've been co-opted into the security space? And what does that do within education, where instead of looking at the young people who you're meant to nurture, teach, care for in that space, you start seeing them in another light? That's how you get the case of, I think it was the 4-year-old who was playing Fortnite and spoke about sort of guns in the shed or something within the context of the video game, and gets referred to Prevent. And those are just some of the examples that exist. I think the youngest I know of is a 4-year-old case, but I'd be shocked and horrified, but sadly not entirely surprised if there's anyone younger than that. So Amnesty International a couple of years ago did a research project into the government's Prevent duty to assess it and the alleged violations against the standards set out in international human rights law and the tests set out in international human rights law. So we did interviews with individuals affected, representatives of other NGOs who had done research into Prevent, legal experts, former and current police officers, and Prevent practitioners. We interviewed 12 people who had been reported to Prevent, 5 of which we featured in the report. We analysed publicly available documentation. We undertook 2 official trainings. We did a questionnaire, and we requested meetings with the Home Office, Police Scotland, and Counter-Terrorism Police. None of them wanted to be interviewed, sadly, for our research. And so what did we find? So I'm just going to read out 2 quotes from the report, and I'll talk about the case studies of this later. So one is of a mother whose son was referred to Prevent, who said, "On certain topics, I tell my children now to keep their opinions to themselves because there's a profile that brown Muslim boys are terrorists. Don't say anything, don't give your opinion." That's the instruction that this mother was given to her child when they go to school. The second is of a workplace union rep who was referred to Prevent by their employer. "There were moments when I thought, if my politics are going to get me sacked, are my politics too extreme? Actually, they're not. I believe in a different society, and Prevent wants to stop people from having my politics." So Amnesty International UK concluded that the UK's Prevent strategy violates some of our most fundamental rights. Its stated purpose, to stop people becoming terrorists. To do so, it requires schools, hospitals, local councils, universities, other institutions to refer to the police people who they think might be drawn to terrorism, even though they have not committed any crimes. A person referred to Prevent, their relatives, can experience life-changing impacts. A loss of trust in state institutions, stress, anxiety, other mental health consequences, unmanageable financial costs associated with challenging referrals, worries about their privacy, their data protection, poor transparency surrounding Prevent, and barriers to redress compound these effects. Efforts by institutions and individuals to comply with Prevent are leading to violations of people's rights to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience, religion, freedom of assembly, and critically, the right to equality and non-discrimination. So our conclusion was quite stark because of the range of violations that we found, which was that the UK must scrap the prevent strategy in order to comply with its international human rights obligations. On discrimination, particularly, actually, I'll maybe talk about this in a different way. Yeah, I'll leave this up there whilst I'm just talking about a couple of other things, just because I think, so that's just like a very condensed version of some of the rights and violations we documented. And it's all available in the report. If you just Google Amnesty International Prevent, you'll have access to the report. It's incredibly long, but it is very interesting. So there's lots of cases, including the ones that we document and highlight in our report. Just 3 that I'll quickly talk about. So Connor was an autistic young man who was referred to Prevent for, amongst other things, an interest in Warhammer, referred by their social worker, afterwards said that they didn't know who to trust anymore. Zane, so when I mentioned before the mother who told their son to stop giving opinions in schools, this was the young person, just started secondary school, year 7, quite a difficult year for most people. Transitioning from primary to secondary is quite a big jump, right? Was struggling to settle in, particularly as a result of unmet learning difficulties and childhood trauma. During a school fire alarm, just said to someone next to them, "Sometimes I wish the school would just burn down." A flippant comment, sure, but not too dissimilar from comments that I've certainly heard from young people in my life who maybe aren't enjoying school during quite a difficult period. 6 weeks later, that comment makes its way around school and is reported back to a teacher as the young person said they were to blow up the school with the teachers in it, right? So classic case of just playground gossip, working its way around, a couple of additions, tweaks, polishes there, referral to Prevent. I think actually I've got the timeline later on of how that mother's been trying to challenge this, and it'll just give some examples of the, just as an example of how difficult it is to challenge things in this space. So returning to the idea of innocence and guilt, to think about how we define or indeed assign these notions onto people and communities. So the link between state national security measures and discrimination, particularly against Muslims, has been widely documented. The Council of Europe's European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance has stressed that Islam and Muslims continue to be associated with radicalization, violence and terrorism, and a dangerous normalization of Islamophobic prejudice can be observed across Europe. UN Special Rapporteurs and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination have raised concerns regarding discrimination against Muslims within the UK's counterterrorism context for a very long time. In fact, last year, for the first time ever, they actually recommended that Prevent be suspended. They've previously only called for it to be reviewed. The Prevent budget previously was allocated based on a local area's Muslim population size according to the census. So there's quite a good report on this by Arun Kannani called Spooked, published in 2008. And what it does is it matches the Prevent budget in different local councils across Europe and maps it against the Muslim population in the census. And they're effectively perfect lines. The higher your Muslim population in that local council, the higher your Prevent budget in that area. So after Prevent was expanded to include other ideologies, a broad range of organizations still assessed it as discriminatory. The UN Special Rapporteur on Racism voiced concern about the policy choice embodied in the Prevent program, which mandates civil servants, social workers, caregivers, educators, and others to make life-altering judgments on the basis of vague criteria in a climate of national anxieties that scapegoat entire religious, racial, and ethnic groups as the presumptive enemy. Prevent relies on non-specialists to judge whether an individual is showing signs of radicalization. Prevent training and guidance advises participants to trust their instincts and trust their gut feeling when making referrals. Claire, a designated secondary school safeguarding lead who we spoke to, acknowledged that decisions about Prevent essentially come down to gut feeling. George, a safeguarding expert and former Channel panel standing member, noted referrals can be made out of anxiety and prejudice and a lack of clarity of what terrorism is. In a society where many people's gut feeling is to view certain groups as inherently more dangerous or more threatening than others, this degree of discretion carries a high risk of discrimination. Surveys of the British public have shown more negative attitudes towards Muslims than towards people of other religions, and a belief that Islam is a threat to Britain. A study in UK universities found that belief that radicalisation is a problem across UK universities and agreement that Prevent is essential in tackling it are both strongly associated with negative views of Islam and Muslims. These negative attitudes towards Muslims are continually reinforced by certain media outlets and politicians. The Muslim Council of Britain's analysis of 48,000 news articles mentioning Muslims or Islam found 60% associated negative aspects and behaviour with Muslims or Islam. These representations built on deeply embedded histories and Orientalist stereotypes, presenting Muslims, specifically men, as innately violent. They also present Islam as inherently antagonistic to perceived Western values and norms, which are themselves grounded in a long history and exclusion towards Jews and Muslims in Europe. The UN Special Rapporteur on Racism condemned outrageous and deeply offensive portrayals in the media, even by leading politicians that cast Muslims as inherently dangerous and opposed to Britain's prosperity and inherently foreign. Evidence of Islamophobia and racism in the police force is particularly worrying. A National Association of Muslim Police survey found 22% of members of the National Association of Muslim Police had personally experienced Islamophobia in the police service. There is also substantial evidence of racism in the Met Police. The police were responsible for 28% of referrals in 2021 to 2022. And they play an important role in conducting initial Prevent case assessments, where it's meant to be the case that referrals deemed discriminatory could potentially be dropped. Another often ignored marginalised group is that of disabled people, and in relation to Prevent, particularly a focus on neurodiversity. There's a high incidence of neurodiversity amongst Prevent referrals. Jonathan Hall Casey, Independent Review of Terrorism Legislation, has stated the incidence particularly of autistic people being referred to Prevent is staggeringly high, and it is as if a social problem has been unearthed and fallen into the lap of counter-terrorism professionals. In evidence submitted to the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee, a representative of the Home Office's Homeland Security Group stated, "If you ask any of my Prevent coordinators across the country, they would say they are seeing a link between autism and some of the right-wing casework. Any mental health professional would say those people are not really qualified to say that," which is an entirely legitimate observation, but it is something I get very regularly from my folks on the ground. Experts in psychiatry believe there is no empirical evidence to link autism and terrorism. The UK's latest counter-terrorism strategy states that there is limited evidence to support a direct causal link between mental ill-health or neurodivergence and an individual's terrorist threat or susceptibility. But the overrepresentation of neurodiverse people in Prevent referrals does not reflect any increased risk of them committing terrorism-related acts. However, instead, some autism features could be mistaken for signs of radicalization within the context of Prevent, such as intense interest, the drive to collect facts and figures about a topic. Autistic people are more likely to be misunderstood or misperceived by other people, including those very same public sector staff who are subject to carrying out the Prevent duty. So, I'm just going to run through a couple of slides. In terms of our key findings within our report, Prevent is incompatible with IHRL, discriminatory against Muslims and neurodiverse people, has a chilling effect. So this is actually people saying that they self-censor, and disproportionately Muslim people saying that they self-censor or they don't talk about political topics at school, at work, in different environments. A worrying lack of transparency, a lack of safeguards on data usage. If when referred to Prevent, your data is held on file for 6 years. There's about close to just around 5,000 referrals to Prevent every year. Last year, for the first time ever, the greatest source of numerical referrals came from the education sector, including for, I think, 300 children under the age of 10, right? So their data is held on file for 6 years. At the end of that 6 years, the data doesn't magically disappear. That referral data can be kept on file for a further 6 years based on the criteria for the original referral. Sorry.
With children, are their parents made aware that there's been a referral and that they're on file?
So Prevent isn't subject to PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which means that parents do not necessarily need to be notified if your child's going to be questioned by Prevent officers in school, or they don't necessarily have to be informed in the same way. So there are cases of children who have been referred to Prevent in school who are taken aside for questioning by police officers, by counter-terrorism police, by others, without their parents being told until after the fact, or any appropriate adult being in the room with them to support them during something like that. And if you imagine when we're talking about children, what does that do to their perception of authority figures going forward and who they believe should be there to support them or not? It's not always the case. Some schools do notify parents and do bring them in during that thing. However, it's not necessarily something that has to be done because it's not subject to PACE. So there's no demonstrable evidence to show that the restrictions on human rights are proportionate and reasonable, let alone that Prevent in and of itself is effective. Right, that's a whole area around the effectiveness of Prevent, which I'm not going to get into today, but there's been lots of questions raised about whether it actually works. So our key recommendations was abolish Prevent, withdraw the strategy, rely on pre-existing safeguarding procedures that have existed for decades, refrain from using overly broad definitions of extremism or terrorism, implement alternatives, ensure people have access to remedy, and address the broader long-term determinants of violence and social harms, which are more likely to lead to people leading secure enough lives that they are less susceptible to things like this. So I spoke about Zain, the fire drill story earlier. I just want to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of data specifically. So Zain was referred in October 2020. Mother filed a subject access request in October 2020 and sought to change information from the police database. In December 2021, a whole year later, the police agreed to delete Zain's records. However, the subject access request that the mother got back around Zain had significant sections redacted. So she complained to the Information Commissioner's Office around the redaction of data in the original subject access request. In 2022, the ICO upheld the police redaction of data in the initial subject access request. So we're now at over 2 years from the original referral. The only place you can go after that is to a first-tier tribunal, an ombudsman who upheld the ICO ruling in 2023. So we're now at 3 years. And in my last contact with the mother, she was still trying to find out what had happened with her child's data and what consequences that would have for him. We know people referred to Prevent could be potentially flagged at the border, and this was her great worry, like going on family holiday, being stopped at the border, being separated from her child. And what other consequences? We know of children who have lost spaces in college because they were referred to Prevent in high school. A young person, I believe it was in East London, who got a place at a very competitive college which had a reputation of sending a proportion of students to Oxbridge and to other competitive higher education institutions, who on what was meant to be their first day at college went in and was told that their college place had been taken away because they had been referred to Prevent in high school. We know of an agreement brokered by the Department for Education between the universities and colleges in Greater Manchester where colleges who made prevent referrals would inform universities of students who had been referred to prevent, as if that should be a key criteria to detail their admission. And remember, this is all a pre-crime space. This isn't something that's been done. This is all around, this is before any action or commission. This is meant to be a voluntary program, but a voluntary program having consequences like that. So within campuses especially, we saw, and within the area of campaigning, we saw universities, local community venues being contacted by prevent officials to discourage events going ahead or imposing conditions that make it very difficult to organize. This includes running every speaker through visiting speaker monitoring processes, asking them what they're going to be talking about, in some cases even asking for the notes of what they're going to be talking about before they attend an event. We've seen trade union, other organizing perceived as grooming. So this was the case of Aaron, a workplace union rep who was referred to prevent for organizing in the workplace. For social media, so they were targeted for organizing in the workplace, and they were referred to prevent for social media posts around housing, anti-capitalism, etc. Might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's legitimate political expression, and was referred to prevent by their employer for that during a time when they were in dispute with their employer and the union. So effectively just targeting, right? Individuals telling us that they were actually withdrawing from civic actions and not joining campaigning groups for fear of prevent. So a couple of years ago, there was a document from, I believe it was the Southeast Counterterrorism Police, which came into the public domain, which listed organizations and logos that people should watch out for, including Extinction Rebellion, Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Stop the War, etc. And people told us, yeah, we've not joined Extinction Rebellion for that reason, because we don't want to be on the radar for prevent. So people are actively not joining and not participating in civic action out of fear that they will come under the purview of the government's counterterrorism strategy. When that happens, you know it's gone too far and it's broken and it's gone beyond the legitimate restrictions set out in international human rights law. I've spoken a bit about this already, but just around discrimination and disability. So we did a survey where 153 people who identified as Muslim, and out of those, 109 told us that they modified their behavior to not be seen as too extreme. Of the 109, 19% used keywords associated with prevent and policing to explain specifically why they changed their behavior. So what often happens when people talk about topics like prevent and pre-crime, this is going back to sort of what you were talking about, and that concept of you're not trained, you're within this society that is prejudiced, and as a result, and you're told to rely on your gut instinct and your gut feeling, and that opens the door for discrimination. So then some people would say, and we've spoken about the fact that prevent destroys the notion of innocence for children, for disabled neurodiverse people, for Muslims, and how individuals in these concepts remain at risk, and how individuals remain at risk based on gut feelings, itself informed by societal discrimination and marginalization, and possible referral to a scheme in a process that could result in taking years of their lives and their trust in public institutions, including ones which they may very well need to access. So sometimes you have vulnerable people who tell us, who say that we're no longer going to speak to our social worker about things that we're worried about because we're worried that they might refer us to prevent. So this is by far not the only pre-crime program that has co-opted other public sectors into its security apparatus, but it is one of the most pervasive and probably I'd say the most well-known. It allows for bias, sanctions gut feeling, gives purview for prejudice to take the reins. So the answer, some people may say, and you may be thinking, is to take the human out of it. If it is gut feelings or possible bias, then hand the decision making over to something without bias, to a machine without a gut. And this is sort of going to be the second half of what we're going to talk about, which is around the automation of systems that generate risk scores and are data-driven and data-based. So Amnesty International has found that 3/4 of UK police forces are using data-based and data-driven systems to attempt to predict, profile and assess the risk of crime occurring in the future. The use of such approaches is influencing decisions in policing and the criminal legal system and people's access to essential services. So I just want to quickly say that during this PowerPoint, I'll be talking about something called predictive policing. That's not because we define it as predictive policing. In fact, what we end up concluding is that this type of policing isn't predictive at all. And one of the experts that we spoke to says that, you know, when you think about who this ends up targeting, it's actually not predictive, it's quite predictable who ends up at the sharp end of this type of policing. But I'm just using it for ease of reference. So there are two main types of predictive policing systems. Let me just see where this slide takes. Oh, okay. So in terms of research systems, the research methodology, for this report, it was about two and a half year project. We sent freedom of information requests to every police force. We faced multiple barriers to transparency. Some didn't get back to us at all. 19 told us that they held no information or they didn't use those systems. We found other evidence that they did. They maybe weren't just defining it in that way or presenting it in that way, but very much the way that those systems worked fell under what we are talking about. We did 3 workshops in areas where systems were impacted. So that, off the top of my head, Essex, Southwark and Lambeth and Hackney. We requested interviews to police forces, none responded saying they wanted to be interviewed, and we wrote to the Minister for Policing and the police forces whose systems we talk about in the report, and we received 1 or 2 responses which we've incorporated into the thing. So what are these systems? So I should say there is no agreed definition of predictive policing by either policing bodies, authorities, others, etc., or by government. What we call predictive policing systems are systems that assess the risk that a crime will be committed. And there's 2 types. So one is person-based and one is place-based. And a key thing is based on the computer-generated risk scores or other hotspot mapping or anything else, the police take measures. So they do something different in seeking to prevent or detect the predicted crime by directing policing efforts. So I spoke about, so one is place-based policing, predictive policing. So I've spoken about that. So almost 3/4 are using it, so right across the country. So individual-based. So individual-based predictive policing systems are systems which focus on individuals seeking to predict their likelihood or risk of certain behavior, such as committing a crime or a criminalized act. These systems are also sometimes referred to as individual risk assessment systems. Police in the UK use these systems to give individuals a risk score, low, medium, or standard, or high. A risk score can influence whether an individual is monitored more closely by police and whether they are subject to additional policing measures, such as stop and search or questioning. These risk prediction scores, profiles can be shared with other state authorities and service providers, including youth offending services, the Crown Prosecution Service, prison and probation services, potentially influencing decision-making in the criminal legal system. They are also shared with Welfare Authority. They're also shared with the Department for Work and Pensions and with local authorities, where they can affect people's ability to access services such as welfare, employment, education, and housing. Right? The second is geographic, so place-based predictive policing. So there are a number of different terms used to describe this form. So geographic, location, place-based, hotspot policing, predictive mapping, etc. all refers to geographic predictive policing. So these are systems which focus on places and seek to predict whether crime will occur there. They profile the area as a high-risk crime area or crime hotspot, and police then use these systems to decide where to send police patrols, what areas to monitor more closely for potential crime, and what areas to target for operations such as stop and search or other exercises of police powers or enforcement, which can and do lead to arrest and detention. So the strategy and the concept of predictive policing is underpinned by the same idea that behaviours can be predicted and people's risk of committing certain behaviour in the future can be accurately assessed. Predictive policing brings together practices from academic, theoretical, practical disciplines and application. So these include data collection on crime, criminality, social factors, economic factors, statistical analysis, mapping of crime data to understand patterns and the conception of risk and assessment in seeking to identify and prevent crime before it occurs. The modern concept of predictive policing is generally credited to William Bratton, the former chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, under whom LAPD began an initiative of predictive analytics to anticipate gang real-time monitoring. And I should also note that since PredPol, which was previously and still is in many places quite prolific in the States, a number of local authorities, state legislatures, and police forces have discontinued the use of predictive policing in the States due to both ineffectiveness and discrimination. But just to quickly say as well, like if we're thinking before all of this as well, and there's a really good article on the Amnesty website if you're interested in thinking about how the contemporary use of predictive policing is itself informed by colonial surveillance and the idea of suspect communities from the colonies to the contemporary. There's a really good blog by Dr. Adam Elliott Cooper, who's the author of a book called Black Resistance to British Policing on the Amnesty website. So if you just Google Adam Elliott Cooper, Amnesty, predictive policing, it should come up. So attempts to map and predict crime are not a new phenomenon. The earliest known crime map was produced by André Michel Goury and Adriano Balbi in 1829. They published a map seeking to show the relationship between levels of education in France and personal and property crime. They could not show a clear statistical correlation. So what we found and our conclusions around PredPol particularly, so the first police force, who says that the first police force to use a commercial geographic PredPol system was Kent Police. They used it for 5 years between 2013 and 2018 at a cost of £100,000 a year. The Home Office funds Operation GRIP, which is £20 million a year, within which I think it's 20 police forces operate hotspot mapping within their authorities. I'll come to this in a second. So what this is effectively showing is what we term in the report as a feedback loop. So police forces use these systems to predict where alleged crime will occur and to predict and profile who will commit crime in the future and who is at risk of committing crime. They then use these predictions and profiles to target specific areas, right? So the map will say this particular area in Southwark is a high hotspot crime area. Police then go in higher numbers to this area in Southwark. Where there is more police, they will find more crime, right? Acts that are criminalized occur everywhere, but the only way that they're reported is when there's a higher degree of police there. So police then record a higher level of crime because the map told them to go there. That is then fed back into the system, and lo and behold, where does it tell you there's a higher area of crime? The same place. So this feedback loop continues and goes round and round. What we found is predictive policing systems are contributing to racist and discriminatory policing, the whole criminalization of areas, groups and individuals, perpetuating institutional racism in society and policing. Their use is leading to the repeated targeting of more deprived areas, including areas with higher populations of black and racialized people, and the targeting of individuals from black and racialized and more deprived backgrounds. So these systems, when they're first rolled out, are developed and operated using data from policing and the criminal legal system. But do you remember all those stats I told you about before around use of force, around around stop and search, around strip searches, all of those things. That data reflects the structural and institutional racism and discrimination already present in things such as police intelligence report, suspect data, stop and search data, arrest data. So there's already inherent bias in that. And therefore, all that happens is this data is used in police predictive profiling and risk assessment systems to develop them, train them, operate them. So these biases lead the system using that data to predict that crime will occur in those same areas, and individuals from those very backgrounds are likely to commit crime. These outputs lead to further repeated targeting of those areas and individuals, creating a compounding cycle of discrimination and criminalization. Individual-focused prediction, profiling, and risk prediction systems similarly lead to people from the same backgrounds, black, racialized, low socioeconomic, being racially profiled and repeatedly targeted. This also results in those people being monitored, subject to stop and search, stop and account, use of force, increased likelihood of engagement with the police. Our conclusion was that these systems amount to indiscriminate mass surveillance, which Amnesty International believes can never be a proportionate response with the rights to privacy, freedom of expression, association, assembly, and therefore we've called for this technology to be prohibited across the UK. And unfortunately, we know that the government is very much moving in the opposite direction and wants to invest in AI within policing and technology within this space. And I just want to talk about one of the ways in which this system works. I'm just trying to see if I've got the clear data on it. Okay, cool. So one of the geographic systems that's operated is something called risk terrain modeling, right? RTM. I think the software is called RTMDX or something, and it's used including by the Metropolitan Police here in London. And the way that works is it assigns risk scores to particular types of buildings. So what I mean by that is a high-rise council estate will have a particular risk score. A semi-detached, nice house in a leafy area will have a different type of risk score. A takeaway in a heavily populated, dense area will have a risk score. A corner shop in that area will have a risk score. So when you then think about where are these types of buildings that are going to be assigned a higher risk, takeaways, corner shops, high-rise council estates, going to be more densely put together, and therefore that area, that community has a higher risk score, because it is working class areas, poor areas, areas with higher with higher proportions of black and racialized people, which will have higher risk scores, and therefore the way that these systems operate is on a map, it shades those areas as higher crime areas. Is where police, and this again going back to this presumption of innocence and presumption of guilt, if you're going into an area that's been identified as higher risk of crime, which has been shaded as this dark grey dot on your map, you're going in with the mentality, and what people told us is police are coming in with the mentality that everyone's already guilty in this area, and that's why it's high crime. It's a high crime hotspot. They're going in with the perception that particular types of people, when we think about the policing disparities, who is most likely to be presumed guilty? Young black boys, young black men, other racialized people, poor people, and they go in, and that's the perception in those areas, and it leads to those same areas being racially profiled and repeatedly targeted or policed. And this is just some of the quotes from people who live in areas that are targeted by predictive policing. One of my favorite ones is bullshit. Any place that is over-policed will report more crime. Mapping of crime areas is already rooted in racism. We found at least 32 police officers across 32 police forces across the UK have used or are using geographic crime prediction or hotspot mapping tools. Operation GRIP, so this is the Home Office funded one. 20 police forces across the UK received significant funding. In an independent evaluation of GRIP published in February last year, the Home Office said results were not as impressive as suggested by the literature on hotspot policing. Few forces demonstrated a statistically significant reduction in crime. Their solution: provide further funding for the same 20 to deliver the programme. And now what are we seeing? The current government is talking about rolling hotspot policing out even further to tackle antisocial behaviour on our streets, right? So it's very much like the same narrative, decades and decades on, right? Not particularly being effective or impactful in any way, but the mass collection of data is indeed happening. So here's just a map, and if you look at the full report on predictive policing, you'll get an idea of what we're talking about here. So this map is from Essex Police, and it's of Southend, and the squares in it are the areas that they've mentioned as high crime areas. And over here, you've got the percentage of Black and African and Black Caribbean people and where they're more likely to be densely populated in the maps. So we've got those maps also for parts of South London where we were able to get the police maps as well. Individual systems, I'll talk about one really quickly. I don't know, before everyone's just going to look at the screen, so I'm going to go back quickly. But has anyone heard of the gangs matrix in London? So the gangs matrix, exactly as you said, was effectively a very crude spreadsheet developed by police officers across London and shared across, which designated people as low, medium or high risk of being involved in gang activity. Completely discriminatory. I think it was something like over 95% of the people on it were black, 99% were men or boys, and it had consequences, and this is the key thing, right? Like people weren't able to get provisional driver's licenses, for example, as a result of being on the matrix. For things such as their music choices, for living on the same street as someone else, for being the cousin of a friend or something, right? It's effectively just criminalized for having a community or living in an area, right? Now, in 2018, I think was it, we published a report about the gangs matrix. And there have been many organisations before us that were raising the alarm on the gangs matrix as well. Amnesty International, along with others, complained to the Information Commissioner's Office about the use of data and data protection breaches within the operation of the gangs matrix. The ICO came back and told the Met that unless they made significant changes, the matrix would have to go. The Met said, cool, we'll scrap the matrix. Then in February gone, they said that they've deleted all the data now that existed around the matrix. However, there were calls by campaigners for that data to actually be held onto by an independent third party in case there were miscarriages of justice that needed to be uncovered. But the Met have said that all copies have been destroyed. So around the time when the Met said they were going to scrap the gangs matrix, something else weirdly came up. Called the Violence Harms Assessment, an individual crime prediction and risk assessment tool used by the Met in London. The force uses it to identify and risk assess individuals involved in violence in London, and it's been in use since 2020. As of August 2024, 66% of people on the Violence Harms Assessment are black, 22.8% white, 5.7% Asian, 4.2% as Arab and North African. So the same discriminatory proportions that existed within the gangs matrix are just replicated. The gangs matrix by another name, effectively. So this was the thing that I was talking about in RTM, so risk terrain modeling, where types of buildings have different scores. And what we found as well is it has something called the chilling effect. And I spoke about this in terms of prevent as well, if you remember, the self-censorship of people. But the way that this operates within the space of predictive policing is people telling us they actually stopped going to certain areas because they've noticed there's more and more police in those areas and they don't feel safe going into there, or they're worried that they're going to be targeted by the police as a result of going there. And we know that actually police themselves know that. So Essex Police acknowledged in their own evaluation that unintended outcomes identified would be the public avoiding RTM areas due to a negative perception of them as being dangerous. So it's not necessarily something that the police are ignorant to, let's say. Here's a case study of someone who was targeted by a system used by Avon and Somerset Police called the Offender Management App. So David found out he'd been profiled after he submitted a subject access request to Avon and Somerset Police. The force confirmed he had been profiled, but they wouldn't tell him anymore, and they wouldn't tell him what his risk score is. Describing his experience, police said, "I was being stopped and searched regularly from the age of 16. I've been stopped and searched over 50 times." Right? And he told us, like, some of the kids, like, just coming out of Tesco's and police just there waiting to stop and search you. And just imagine the consequences that could have. He also found out the force held incorrect data about his criminal record, and he thinks that's probably why he was risk scored in the first place. He asked them to correct the record. They said they wouldn't. It took a legal challenge to get them to change it. And it had incredible consequences for him, suffering post-traumatic stress disorder, and one of the things that's quite clear is it's not just the trauma of finding this out, it's that re-traumatization from every police interaction subsequently. You're not informed you're on a system, you don't get told why you're on a system, you don't get told how to challenge the fact you're on a system. There's no recourse, no remedy, no ability to find this out and challenge this, right? So, predictive policing systems produce predictions, profiles, risk assessments. This amounts to suspicion of criminality or actual labels of criminality about a person or a group in a particular area. That suspicion or label is based on data which does not amount to evidence of a criminal conviction or amount to formal suspicion in the form of a charge, but it just reflects a profile, an opinion of potential guilt. These predictions can lead to policing interventions and consequences for individuals and groups who are profiled and labelled. So this, we believe, risks violating the presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial. People in those areas targeted are presumed guilty. Police are predisposed to seeing their behaviour as criminal or dangerous, increasing their risk of criminalisation. Police using these systems have sought to highlight how predictions have led to targeted patrols of areas, increased use of stop and account, stop and search, or arrests. Even more directly, individuals and remember, the people on these lists haven't committed a crime, right? So but they're still not presumed innocent because they're on these systems. Individuals are profiled and labelled as criminals based on intelligence reports and mere suspicion of involvement in crime without objective evidence. A person can be profiled without having committed a crime, and indeed some people can be put on systems as a result of being the victim of a crime. These profiles lead to monitoring and interventions, including stop and search, home visits, continuing the cycle of criminalisation. I've already spoke about the different authorities and bodies that this data can be shared with. The use of these preemptive systems to target people and groups before they have offended risks infringing on their presumption of innocence and the right to a fair trial. And as these systems can also be used in sentencing, they also risk undermining the principles of consistency in sentencing as well. Every person charged with a criminal offence has the right to be presumed innocent until and unless proven guilty, according to the law after a fair trial. Predictive policing systems produce predictions, profiles, risk assessments amounting to suspicions of criminality or actual labels of that. There have been multiple legal challenges on the front of Prevent in particular, but as I mentioned before, if you just look at that one mother's case, and she told us she spent, I think, upwards of a good couple of £1,000s to find legal routes, and actually 2 solicitors and barristers that she'd approached previously didn't take the case on, and it's because the area is so shrouded in secrecy and difficulty that that there aren't many specialists in the area. And a barrister, as part of the Prevent research, we interviewed a barrister who, I'm paraphrasing here, said the threshold to be engaged by Prevent is very low. The threshold to challenge it is very high.
And is it going to be the same with this crime prediction?
Yeah, so there is. So when we took our executive summary and our recommendations to government and asked for a response, they told us, well, we're quite confident because we have this thing called the algorithmic transparency standard. So police forces, so public sector bodies have to talk about and mention the different sort of algorithms and this sort of technology that they're using and its consequences, etc. No, they don't. It's not statutory. It's not enforceable. just, I told you 3/4 of police forces use systems like this. 2 police forces have registered their systems on the algorithmic transparency standard. So there's dozens that haven't. And we're not talking, and one of the things that often happens when you talk about these systems is people think, but it's only the troublemakers on the radar who are being run through these systems. Firstly, even if that were true, even if they're disliked or seen as troublemakers or whatever, if they've not committed a crime, they've not committed a crime, the presumption of innocence. But also, that's not the case. The Avon and Somerset police system that I spoke about David's story in, I think over 200,000 people have been run through that system. The West Midlands knife crime analytical tool, I think it's over 300,000 people have been run through that system. We're not talking about small numbers. Hundreds of thousands of people have had their name run through systems to determine whether or not they will generate a risk score. People don't know if they are one of those. They don't know what that means for them. They don't know what's happened with their data. And because of the exemptions within, as a result of being, as a result of states having a responsibility to protect their citizens, they are trying to, they're destroying the presumption of innocence and replacing it effectively with the presumption of guilt. And who's more likely to be perceived as guilty? Marginalised communities, already discriminated against communities, vulnerable communities, and individuals within them. So the rights that were violated that we found were obviously not to be discriminated against, to be presumed innocent, the right to privacy, the freedom of association, and there's a risk to ESC rights because this information is shared with local authorities and with Department for Work and Pensions and stuff. ESC means economic, social and cultural rights. So things like someone's universal credit, access to social housing, all of those things could be at risk for being on a system which they have no knowledge about, right, based on a generated risk score. So there's certainly a number of corporations that we identify within the report who are particularly, whose systems are used. So one is, for example, SimSci, I think that's a US-based contractor who had contracts and had made approaches to a number of police forces here in the UK. Predpol, that system that Kent Police was using, is a US-based geographical predictive policing system, cost of £100,000 a year. And then you have the government contracts, right, that also exist. So on this basis, using preemptive systems to target people, even though they haven't offended, risks infringing on the presumption of innocence. So just to quickly wrap up that one by saying that we've made a number of recommendations, including that the system should be prohibited, so should be completely banned in their use in the UK. Transparency. There should be a public register of the systems that have been in operation, their consequences, and there should also be ways for people to find out whether they have been profiled by a system. So, not we believe ridiculous asks. But yeah, so today so far we've spoken about the notions of guilt and innocence, the ways in which these notions are utilized by the state to establish projects and programs of surveillance, suspicions under the guise, this is really important, under the guise of safety, right? It prevents her because we're keeping you safe from terrorists. These systems are here because we're keeping you safe from criminals. The fanciful notions that technology, which is fed and trained with discriminatory data, is objective, and the sanctioning of gut feelings. So it's crucial when we're thinking about the ways in which pre-crime programs like Prevent and predictive policing operate, we start to think about how we push back. For me, that comes down to spaces like this, where we start to think where we tie the two together. Both Prevent and predictive policing are pre-crime programs. Both rope in public sector bodies. Both rely on institutionalized racism and discrimination to operate. Both result in impacted people feeling fearful of accessing key services. And both rely on us being willing to wash away our rights and allow them to continue. So that's why it's so important to push back. And we know, and international evidence shows, that violating our rights is an incredibly ineffective route to increasing public safety. There are rights respecting routes to increasing public confidence and increasing public safety, and it's up to us to make those arguments and challenge the presumption of guilt that is often assigned to Black, Muslim, racialized, poor, disabled people and communities. The charge of guilt that is assigned to those who present, behave, or are perceived as the other and to return to a struggle for dignity, liberty, and respect and protection for all of us. So that was the sort of, that's the end of everything I wanted to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions or have a conversation with you folks.